My name is Rachel Stevenson, and I'm the Event and Social Manager here at Identity Automation, and I will be your moderator today. Today is part 5 of our webinar series, Advancing Your Identity Management Strategy with the IAM Maturity Model, where we'll be diving into the Identity Lifecycle Management Maturity Model. So now it's time for the webinar. I'm going to be passing the mic and controls over to Greg for him to give a brief overview of he and Troy's time here at Identity Automation and a further explanation of the full IAM Maturity Model itself. Take it away, Greg.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome, everyone. My name is Greg Pearson, and I will be one of the presenters today. I've been with Identity Automation for 10 years, focusing on identity and access management, and spent the balance of my career in various roles in technology, including leadership, strategy, and consulting. I'm joined today by Troy Moreland, our founder and identity fellow at Identity Automation. Troy is an industry expert in the area of identity and access management, having deployed various solutions in hundreds of organizations. Hello, Troy.
Hey, good afternoon, Greg.
Alrighty, so let's get things started. To help those attendees who are new to our webinar series, I'd like to spend just a moment reviewing what a maturity model is and how it can be applied to IAM. A maturity model is a tool used to determine the effectiveness of current capabilities in a particular area of focus and can help provide a decision path and prioritization for increasing that capability through maturity. Applying a maturity model to IAM is looking at various tenets within the IAM space, evaluating the current level for each, and determining next steps to increase capability to move to the next level. As a reminder, this webinar series focuses on each of the core tenet areas of IAM and explores various levels of maturity and capability in each tenet. The underlying concept is to provide a framework that can be covered in smaller, digestible segments and can be used as a tool to help organizations evaluate where they are at in their overall IAM strategy, as well as what areas to focus on in order to increase their level of maturity. It's important to mention that organizations may have products or solutions for various tenets of IAM in place already and may be at various levels of maturity. Also important to note, there is not a rule that says that an organization has to implement each of the tenets in any particular order. That being said, let's jump into our topic for this segment. In this part of our series, we'll focus on the maturity levels of lifecycle management. In our previous webinars, we focused on federation, multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, and delegated administration, in which Troy covered the maturity of those tenets. If you haven't seen these, the recordings are available under the resource section on our website. Today, we'll focus on the concept of identity lifecycle as part of an IAM solution and how it can benefit the organization as a whole and how it ties into the other tenets of IAM. Lifecycle management is a core focus of IAM that is important to discuss before we move into access management and governance, as it serves as a foundation for those tenets. As Troy will highlight in the next couple of slides, lifecycle management can have a number of paths to getting to a desired state, but some work more efficiently than others and provide in-depth coverage of identities that some organizations might not realize should be included. Troy is now going to take us through the levels of maturity of the lifecycle management. With that, Troy, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Greg. So I'm pretty excited about talking about the identity lifecycle management maturity model, specifically because at least in my opinion, it is probably the most important tenet of your entire identity management strategy. And the reason is it's what's going to directly tie in all of the applications or services that your users are accessing. So a lot of the other maturity models that we talk about are going to have some sort of dependency typically on ILM. So what exactly is ILM? I just want to have a little baseline definition, if you will. So it's really about handling the creation and any changes and removal of identities across all of the applications or services that your end users are accessing. The life cycle being the key part of that. So it's constantly going to be listening for events and then taking appropriate actions across your entire ecosystem. Another thing I wanted to mention is you might hear ILM, Identity Lifecycle Management, and you might also hear or see ALM, which is Automated Lifecycle Management. In fact, on our website, if you look at capabilities, you'll see ALM. They are synonymous, exactly the same. It's just when I talk about it, I usually like to use the word identity so that we're very clear that we're talking about identity matters as opposed to just saying automated, which could really refer to anything in any industry. But they are synonymous when you know you're talking about identity management. So the goal is to automate these processes everywhere, because that's the only way we are going to be able to ensure that identities across all of these disparate systems are going to be in a state that matches what's found in authoritative sources. So ILM is something that happens manually, but obviously we're going to get the most out of an automated solution. And one other point of clarity before I start talking about the different levels is the term identity itself. So, when we say the creation and updates and removals, of course, we're all thinking about user accounts, and those would be the identities. But it's not necessarily constrained to just user accounts. It's any account that is going to need access. So it certainly could also be identity lifecycle management for things like IoT devices, external services for service-to-service access, and things of that nature. So not to be restricted, but primarily when you hear us talk about it in the flavor today, it's going to be primarily focused, or at least using the context of users. All right, so the maturity model itself, as has been with all of our models, is made up of 4 levels. So I'll just briefly kind of go through these, and then we'll get into the detail slide next here. So we see level 1 of the ILM maturity model as being homegrown. So that means over the years, your technical staff that are responsible for the identities for the systems that they manage, they are doing whatever they can individually to develop scripts or what have you to at least partially automate a portion of ILM. So if you have Active Directory, you might have Active Directory staff, and they have implemented PowerShell scripts to take data from maybe the HR team or an email to kind of automatically create accounts for them, which is okay, but it's very, very partial. But then you've got other applications with other technical staff kind of doing the same thing, but with different methods. And so that's what we're referring to as homegrown. Level 2 is onboarding. So typically your first action to implement within ILM is onboarding, sometimes referred to as provisioning, and it's for setting up new access. And the reason why that's usually the starting point is because that's where user requests usually come from. They need more access, and so those are the types of requests that we try to handle sooner than later. Therefore, we can reduce a lot of the burden of all of those manual inbound requests to have new access. And then the third level, which is when things start getting useful and where we really want them to be, is when we start implementing an identity logic engine, or just engine, if you will. And so the ILM engine helps organizations centralize all of the lifecycle management instead of all of your disparate groups doing their own thing. And the greatest benefit is that we're managing the entire lifecycle management process, which is made up of numerous events and not just the onboarding aspect. And then finally, level 4, which is somewhat a future concept, but as I'll discuss here shortly, there's a lot of groups and standards being made or being published today to basically describe that this is where the industry is going. But it's API driven. And what this is referring to is the fact that it's hoping to reduce the complexity that when you look at your entire ILM implementation, so let's say if you've got every application in your ecosystem integrated using your engine, you're ingesting data from the source and you're pushing data to all of those targets. And that pushing is a unique setup for every system. And that gets, it can get complicated depending on how many applications and how disparate those applications are. So the API driven is the thought of having the target systems or downstream systems pull the data themselves using very standard RESTful APIs. And so we will talk about that in detail as well. So that's the highlights. If there's any questions, great. If not, we can move on to the next slide.
Thanks for that great overview, Troy. A couple of things I just want to clarify for our audience here, just to get some thoughts out there. Would it be fair to say that one of the downsides of maybe a homegrown solution is that it may not adapt fast enough to changes in an organization? Maybe is that one of the greatest downsides?
It's definitely a significant one. If you've got a person who has built some homegrown scripts, that of course is not their primary job. Their primary job is probably maintaining the infrastructure. So they're really just implementing scripts usually to help automate the mundane tasks that they're working on. So if they're trying to do homegrown to do a complete ILM, then yeah, it's going to take a lot of time usually to get any new integrations put into place. But as we'll talk about here in the next slide, there's even bigger concerns when it comes to homegrown ILM implementations, and I will certainly cover those here shortly.
Great. One more, and then we can move on to the detail here. In your experience, Troy, have you seen that organizations have the most difficulty with role changes or moves and transfers as part of that identity lifecycle?
Yes. So the changes that happen between, let's just use an employee as an example, between a new hire and a termination, those changes that happen in between, which can be numerous, are certainly technically the most complicated types of events to deal with properly, for sure. From a security aspect or from a risk mitigation aspect, it's making sure that we are doing a great job of handling disabling of accounts, for termination type of events, and those get lost very often in the mix of what's going on when it's not fully automated. So yeah, but yes, technically speaking, handling all of those changes and making sure the appropriate actions are taken across all of our different applications is without an ILM engine is really difficult to do.
Great, thanks. All right, we'll take you to the next slide, and you can tell us all about the detail on each of these levels.
Great. So in the other maturity models, we've talked about the fact that we've got our 4 levels, but that there's also the undocumented level 0, and ILM is no different. So if to be level 0 means that every one of your applications that your users are accessing, that administration of those accounts and their access is all being done manually, by hand. So it still surprises me to talk to a new customer or to talk to people at trade shows to hear that the way they do identity management is they get an email from the HR department and someone has to go through that list of new hires or changes or people leaving the organization. They have to go through those lists and then make their own determination of what actions they need to take across one application or numerous applications. And those emails get blasted out to different people who are responsible for different applications. So that whole process is definitely what we would consider level 0, which leaves you just really riddled with issues from missed events or things of being hand typed, being erroneously typed, and things of that nature. So that's the level 0 for ILM, which usually, we're human, and especially in the IT world, which I've been in for, coming up on 27 years, I think. Back when I did administration of different applications, I was always looking for a way to be more efficient. And nothing was worse than getting a big list and having to go through that manually. It would take my entire day to do that. So I was always looking for a way to make my job easier. And so that's where the homegrown solutions come to be. So, the application owners, maybe selfishly, maybe not, but they're just doing something that helps them do their job. So that's great, but it's not, it's great for that group maybe, but it's not great for the organization, because now you have different application owners doing different solutions, different platforms, and one is strong with Linux, one's strong with Windows, one is strong with Python, another is strong with PHP or Bash. So you have all these different places and platforms for all these scripts where they exist. Another thing is it's usually one person who really understands what's being built, and we all know that we have that person in our organization, and if something happens to them or if they leave, that always puts us into a bit of a pickle as well. And I guess sadly, we get a lot of new customers, sometimes because of that. Someone leaves and the organization has felt really handcuffed, that they don't want to make any changes to anything because they've lost the expertise to manage those homegrown scripts. And so they then, realize they need to take the next steps, which in this case is looking for something that is more off the shelf, so that you can have support, not just internally, but also externally. Looking for off the shelf, but many times being budget constrained. And anyone that's in management or has ever been in management, you always know you're trying to do as much as you can with the limited budget that you have. And because of this, tackling the entire identity lifecycle management problem is probably not going to happen day one. And so what happens, a lot of organizations focus on just what they are hearing from their end users the most, which are complaints about new access. So that's why next steps usually are looking at an onboarding solution. Does that make sense? Any questions on that, Greg?
No questions. We can go on to level 2.
Okay. So level 2, we're starting to deploy tools that are at least going to partially automate the ILM process, partially because it's focused just on the creations. And again, this is kind of due to internal customer demand. There's a lot of target system vendors out there that are providing import tools, and it's because these vendors are getting pressure from paying customers that it's really difficult to get their application to be useful without the ability to somehow migrate users and perhaps groups and other things into that system. So that's kind of the first level of onboarding that we see are vendor-provided import capabilities. Of course, that is good, but it's only good really at the time that import finishes. At that one point, it's up to date. Now we still have the problem of, well, what happens, as changes are coming across. So one example we have very frequently with our education customers is they will be able to bulk load their their teachers and students and courses. But now throughout the semester, as students come in, come out, course enrollments change, all that's having to be done manually. So it's only, again, handling part of the issue. The second type of tools that we see are tools that can synchronize, but they're really just synchronizing using a mirroring solution. So a good example of that is if you have Active Directory and then you decide to use Google or G Suite, Google has their own cloud directory sync tool. So that allows you to set up their tool that will synchronize your Active Directory users and structure and everything to exactly mirror that within Google. So that sounds great again, because the good news is it's creating it, and as new users get created in Active Directory, those are also being created in Google as well. But the problem is that's forcing you to do your Google security based on your Active Directory structure and attributes. And that's not always ideal. In fact, it's seldom a desire of people who administer Google or the other applications that do this type of mirroring capability. But it's easy, usually it's cheap, and that's a lot of reasons why customers are starting with those tools. Next steps that really are going to push us to get to level 3. One way that we all know that we can mitigate risk of data breach is to implement the principle of least privilege. So in case that's a new term, that principle just means that a user should only have access to perform the functions to do their job at the time that they are performing that task, which might be a little restrictive, but that is the principle. So that type of principle could only be implemented with full identity lifecycle management and even a smattering of governance, which we will talk about 2 maturity models from now. But with that in mind, the organizations are recognizing the need for the fully automated ILM engine to support their business processes from start to finish. Any questions about that?
I don't have a question per se, Troy, but I just wanted to reemphasize what I think you said and just summarize it. Basically, onboarding really summed up is generally a tool for in large mass getting accounts created so that people are up and functioning or accounts are up and running. There are some tools out there that do sync, but that's more of a mirror, and it doesn't really reflect maybe even the capability of that application or system. And it doesn't really handle the other portions of a lifecycle event, so changes or certainly offboarding. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes, exactly. So typically it's either a one-time bulk load, and then it's up to you to handle everything else, or it would be some sort of mirroring, which doesn't really implement the full life cycle, but worst of all, it forces a business process within those systems, to abide by how that data is getting force fed. There's no logic, there's no transformations. You can't implement the process that you would likely want when you use these, what I would call a force feed tool. So that gets us to level 3, when things start getting fun. And this is where we're going to implement the engine. And if you look at our website, you might see Logic Engine, and that is also synonymous, same exact thing. So one quick side note, we talk to analysts all the time, Gartner probably being the most common conversations that we have. And the analysts tell all of the IAM vendors, certainly not just identity automation, but they tell all of us that customers that they talk to are saying that they want to implement ILM best practices as provided by those vendors. And I always find that sort of funny, because from personal experience, and I've done hundreds of implementations across all verticals. I think customers do believe that they should implement best practices, and they're honest in telling an analyst that that's what they desire to do. But what happens is once the project gets started, that's when the customer starts getting educated on what is going to happen as these things get automated. And again, in our experience, 100% of the time, customers realize that implementing a best practice approach is going to force them to change business processes across the board, which would involve other departments having to change business processes as well, namely HR, when we're talking about internal identities. So therefore, what always happens then is that a customer will then, talk to the vendor and say, really, we don't want best practice. We need an implementation that can implement our existing processes. So that, I'm bringing that up because you could hear, depending on what you're reading, you can hear that people are looking for best practice. I am certainly here to tell you that when it comes down to it, you really need a engine that is flexible enough to implement whatever business logic you require for your business processes. Doesn't mean you wouldn't have to change anything, but you certainly shouldn't have to change everything because of a tool. So implementing the engine also provides you with direct integration with your authoritative sources. So again, if we're talking about employees, that's the HR system, maybe the payroll system, maybe even a combination. If you're in an education environment, the student management system. If you're in the healthcare environment, the EMS. So any source system that is authoritative of identities and their attributes. So in the case of an employee, the lifecycle events that happen within the HR system are being hired, being transferred, being promoted, terminated, rehired, your name changes, conversions from employee to contractor and vice versa, to name a few. So these are the events that you have to look at on an application by application basis to see or to determine what actions do we need to take for each of those applications. Because we're not, this is a holistic approach, a centralized approach. And so we're not just concerned about, say, Active Directory and what we do there, but we need to know we need to implement the rules and the logic that will take the appropriate actions for each application based on the events that come from the authoritative systems. All that's fantastic, and we could easily spend way more than 45 minutes just talking about the engine and what it provides. But next steps would be where we've got our engine, we're doing our integrations. What you'll eventually learn is, if the larger the organization, the more applications that you are supporting because of what your end users are accessing. And if you're wanting to make certain that you're only providing people with the access that's appropriate, making sure that you take away that access when appropriate, then you're trying to tie all these things together. The hardest part is every time you start looking at another system to integrate, you have to learn its protocols. You have to learn its APIs. You have to learn its capabilities. And, of course, that can be very difficult. And even as an organization that does this for a living, our consultants keep a toolbox, if you will, so that if one consultant ever works with a certain application, our other consultants can learn from what they learned. So next step is how can we deal with simplifying that and being more efficient and all of those goodies. And that is by looking at providing standard-based RESTful APIs and data structures that we can provide to third-party vendors, third-party applications, that they can pull the data from it rather than us always having to design ways of pushing data to them. So any questions before I get into the details of the API driven?
Just again, planting a thought for our listeners out there. So also adding to the concept of an engine here, I'm assuming, Troy, we'd want to consider things from a full automation perspective for the entire ecosystem, all sources of truth, all targets, and then we're going to rely on data to drive events and compare to maybe a rule-based and apply that to all systems for all identities. And when I say all identities, it could be any kind of identity in the organization. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about it from an audit perspective, if I'm an auditor and I come into your organization, I'm going to say, Greg, show me all the access that Troy has. If you have a complete ILM implementation in place, that is much easier to do. Whereas if you're only doing the onboarding, or certainly if you're doing the homegrown or level 0 of manual, what that means is you're going to have to go to these different applications individually, try to figure out, do the correlation yourself as to does Troy have an account there? If he does, what access? And then thirdly, how did he get that access? So ILM is implementing, it's automating, fully automating what we call birthright access. So birthright would refer to logic or rules whose criteria are being met by the data we get from authoritative sources. So in the HR system, I know your position, I know your department, I know your location, I know your manager, all these things. So these are what rules look at to say, okay, I see Troy, I see his attributes. What do I need to do in Active Directory? Well, that's going to tell me what structure to put him in. It's going to tell me what groups to put him in. In other applications, it could be what permissions should they get, or should they even get access with those attributes? Or, hey, last time you were in the IT department, now you're in finance. That's going to tell me to make sure I remove the IT permissions and only have the finance permissions. So yeah, I mean, all of that is absolutely necessary, or the engine is absolutely necessary to ensure these things, which is why I said at the very beginning, the other tenets of identity management really can't be fully, what's the word I'm looking for? Can't be fully realized if you don't also have ILM that's looking at these events and then taking the actual actions on the downstream systems and applications themselves. Does that answer your question or clarify your clarification?
It does. Great.
All right, so level 4, again, the biggest barrier to implementing ILM everywhere is that you're going to have a lot of disparity across those applications and services. There's a lot of legacy systems. You'll run into some pretty proprietary systems or closed systems that don't really give you an interface necessarily to directly interface with. We have, for example, we have adapters or connectors, if you want to call it that, for generic legacy things, and we consider the worst case as creating files that we can push to those applications and they can consume those files, and that would be pretty much the lowest common denominator. But there's a huge bit of disparity there. Consuming the data usually from the authoritative sources themselves is usually not that complicated. Again, if you think about an HR system, those systems or the vendors that build those systems are very aware that people are going to need to consume data from those. So they have a lot of mechanisms to expose that data. Sometimes, unfortunately, it might still be through text files, but usually we can access via the backend database, or better yet, more and more of them are starting to provide web service APIs. But either way, consuming that data is the easier part. It's, again, when you look downstream, the target systems are, unlimited numbers of them, and they're all different. So instead of building each one of those integrations, we want to provide a very standard RESTful API. Every developer worth their weight today are all familiar with RESTful APIs. They're familiar with JSON structures. And so this is becoming the de facto means for allowing integration or data synchronization between systems. And that I think I mentioned earlier, even though this is a little bit of forward thinking or future proposition, you will find a lot of information when you start Googling things like data sharing standards and such, and you're going to find a lot of work that's being done around that. Some examples are there's a financial data exchange. So that's a web service API standard for financial organizations to exchange data. There's parcel data exchange. That is for interactions between, say, United States Postal Service and FedEx. In the education space, there's a standard by IMS Global called One Roster that describes exactly how to share all roster information between disparate systems. And then there's some open initiatives, such as the Open API initiative. There's a JSON API standard. So the whole reason these are being developed is because of this global problem of the complexity of sharing data between all these disparate systems. So whether it's identity management or just, non-identity type of data, this is something that's being always being looked at. And so identity management is certainly one to benefit from this. And if you want to see an example that's consumer facing, I would encourage you to look at an application or it's a cloud service called Zapier. And Zapier does a great job of letting end users, and I mean non-technical users, connect their disparate cloud services. So you can do something like every time I receive an email into my Gmail account, I want to add a calendar alert. That was a horrible example, but the point is Zapier exists strictly because all of the applications that it integrates and lets you integrate with are using web service APIs. So those other consumer-facing product vendors are going into Zapier's developer portal and basically registering their APIs. So that makes them available now for all consumers to be able to either get data from that system or push data to that system. I use it all the time to keep things like all of my Google systems in sync with Trello, in sync with Slack, and things of that nature. So again, I just wanted to have a real world example of, this API-driven service integration concept. And that's really all I had. If there are any other questions that I can clarify?
Not right at the moment. We're getting short on time here, so we'll move to the next slide. No, this is mine. So this just right here is an example of a maturity scorecard. So we just put together something using a simple spreadsheet showing that the various levels that we were at in each one of our different tenets. So as an example, you could take this, evaluate where you are in each of, as we go through these maturity models webinars, evaluate what level you're at, and then create a radar graph like the one that's on the right there that allows you to see overall where you're at and how you can continue to grow based on the various levels for each tenant. So again, it may not need to be that you need to grow out to level 4 on everything. Level 3 may be the area that you need to be in for a particular tenant. But this gives you sort of a working model. So that's really what that is, just as an example. And I think from there, that's what we've got.
So Greg, do we have any remaining questions?
Looks like we had one come in. So Troy, they said, if I want to do just SSO, do I need ILM?
Yeah, great question. Directly, maybe not. Indirectly, absolutely. What I tell people frequently, especially when they are comparing rapid identity to a product that really just focuses on single sign-on, the one thing I'll always bring up is single sign-on is great, but you still have to have an identity in that application for single sign-on to function. So single sign-on is great for the end user, but it's still not removing the need to manage your identities across the different, across all those applications. And that also gets back to what I was saying, where ILM, more than any of the tenets we talk about, is so tightly bound to all other tenets, because you really can't have a complete SSO solution if you're not also automating the management of those identities that single sign-on is going to work with. And that's true of other things. We're going to talk about governance pretty soon. So just I guess a future thought, governance is about ensuring that we're removing access, based on a time frame or based on a certification campaign. It's funny how many applications can show you the campaign, but they're not actually taking the action in the downstream application. So I can show you that, your access to this particular system has expired, but it doesn't have ILM attached, so it's not actually removing that. It's usually sending a notification to the application owners, letting them know that they need to remove this access. So again, that's two examples, SSO and governance, but really ILM is tied to everything. It is the core. It's the brain of the entire nervous system as we know identity management.
Thanks, Troy. That was the only question we had. So Rachel?
Alrighty, well, then that wraps up our Q&As. So just a final reminder for everyone, we are going to be sending out a recording of today's webinar, as well as all of the questions asked today throughout the presentation and after with their answers. And also, if you did ask any case-specific questions, we'll be answering directly to you to get you the best answer possible, as well as answer any follow-up questions that you may have. So once again, I want to thank Greg and Troy for their time preparing and giving today's presentation, everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules to log on and join us, and a big thank you to those who will be downloading and listening to this after the fact. We look forward to continuing this series next month on October 9th with part 6, covering the access management maturity model. If you have already signed up, we will be sending out your registration reminder information. And for those of you who have not signed up, be sure to keep your eyes peeled for an email with details on how to register. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope everyone has a great day.